Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Tonight we're going to talk about a mystery. Not the comfortable kind of mystery that comes wrapped in a solution waiting to be unwrapped, but the kind that genuine historical inquiry produces when the evidence runs out before the story does, when the documents stop and the archaeology goes quiet and you are left standing at the edge of what is knowable, looking into the space where certainty used to be, and finding that the space is larger and darker than you expected. Tonight's mystery is one of the most debated questions in Roman military history, one that has generated more speculation, more fiction, more documentary filmmaking, and more scholarly argument per surviving fragment of evidence than almost any other question about the ancient world. What happened to the 9th Legion of Rome? The Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Legion, called Hispana the Spanish, for a reason we will examine, was one of the oldest and most storied military formations in the Roman army. It had fought in some of the most significant campaigns in the history of the Republic and the early Empire. It had crossed the Alps with Julius Caesar, subdued the tribes of Hispania, served in Africa, participated in the invasion of Britain, and spent decades on the most contested and most dangerous frontier of the Roman world. And then, at some point in the 2nd century of the Common Era, it disappears from the historical record completely. The last confirmed reference to it in the epigraphic evidence places it in Britain in the early 2nd century. After that, nothing. No record of its disbandment, no record of its destruction in battle, no record of its transfer to another theatre. It simply ceases to appear in the documents that survive, and the silence that follows is one of the most haunting in the entire archaeological record of the ancient world. The popular version of this mystery, the one that Rosemary Sutcliffe turned into a beloved novel in 1954, The Eagle of the Ninth, the one that has been made into films and television series, and that has embedded itself in the popular imagination as one of the great adventure stories of the ancient world, is that the 9th Legion marched north into Scotland in the early 2nd century to suppress a Caledonian uprising, walked into the mist beyond Hadrian's wall, and was never seen again. It is a wonderful story. It is the kind of story that the landscape of northern Scotland, with its brooding hills and its sense of inhabiting the edge of the known world, seems specifically designed to make you believe. It is also, as modern scholarship has demonstrated with increasing clarity, almost certainly not what happened. The truth is both more complicated and in its way more interesting than the legend, because the truth is the history of what a Roman legion actually was, how it actually operated, what the evidence actually shows, and why the mystery is genuinely mysterious rather than merely romantically obscure. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the room soften. The fire is low and the mist is up. And let us go back, a very long way back, to understand what the 9th Legion actually was before we can begin to understand what might have happened to it. A Roman legion was not, in the way that modern military units tend to be, a fixed and permanent thing with a continuous institutional identity. It was more like a living organism that could grow, shrink, divide, merge, be reconstituted after near total destruction, and still carry the same number, the same eagle standard, and the same institutional memory as the unit that had existed centuries before. The Roman legion system had evolved from the earliest Roman army of the Republic, a citizen militia organised on the Greek phalanx model, through the reforms of Marius in the late Republic, which professionalised the army and created the standardised heavy infantry formation that would be the core of Roman military power for the next 5 centuries, into the complex multi-component formation of the imperial period that we most associate with the image of the Roman soldier. A fully constituted legion of the early imperial period numbered approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men. Most sources give a theoretical strength of around 5,120 legionaries in 10 cohorts, the first cohort being double strength at 800 men, and the remaining 9 cohorts at 480 men each, plus officers, specialists, and attached auxiliary units that could bring the total force the legion commander controlled to considerably more. The men of the legion were Roman citizens. This was one of the legal requirements of legionary service throughout most of the imperial period, and it was a requirement with real meaning, because Roman citizenship was both a legal status and a social identity that carried specific rights and obligations, including the right to serve in the legions. The auxiliary units that fought alongside the legions, cavalry, archers, slingers, light infantry specialists, were typically drawn from provincial populations who did not hold citizenship, though citizenship was increasingly granted to auxiliaries who completed their service, which was itself one of the mechanisms through which citizenship spread across the empire. The legion's internal organisation reflected the specific tactical requirements of the heavy infantry battle that Roman military doctrine centred on. Each cohort was divided into 6 centuries of 80 men, each century commanded by a centurion, the professional officer class that was the real institutional spine of the Roman army. The centurions were not the equivalent of modern junior officers. They were career soldiers, often of many decades' experience, who provided the professional continuity and the tactical expertise on which the legion's function depended. The most senior centurion in the legion, the primus pilus, literally the first spear, was a figure of immense institutional authority and considerable social prestige, often from a middle-class background, and promotion through the centurionate was the primary career path for talented common soldiers, whose ambitions the army needed to absorb and direct. Above the centurions were the military tribunes, 6 per legion, mostly young men of the equestrian class gaining their required military experience as part of the cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices that formed a Roman aristocratic career, and at the top, the legate, the legion's commander, typically a senator serving his required military command before proceeding to higher political office. Before we discuss the eagle's symbolic weight, it is worth understanding the daily human reality of the institution that carried it, because the 9th Legion was not primarily a symbol or a narrative device, but a community of several thousand human beings whose daily lives had a specific texture and routine that the institutional history tends to obscure. What did it actually mean to be a soldier of the 9th Hispana? The physical demands of legionary service began before any campaign and never fully ended. The Roman military training regime was systematic and unrelenting in ways that distinguished the professional imperial army from the citizen militia that had preceded it. New recruits, Tirones as the training manuals called them, underwent months of basic training that included marching under full kit at the regulation pace of 20 Roman miles in 5 summer hours, swimming, jumping, running, weapons drill with oversized wooden practice swords and wicker shields, and the specific physical conditioning that the century's training program prescribed. The training manuals that survive, particularly the military treatise of Vigesius from the late 4th century, which describes training practices that were already old by his time, give a picture of a training regime whose sophistication and systematic character would not look entirely out of place in a modern professional military. The full kit that a marching legionary carried on campaign weighed approximately 45 Roman pounds, perhaps 30 to 40 modern kilograms, including weapons, armour, personal equipment, tools, and a portion of the unit's cooking equipment. The weapons were the standard equipment of the legionary infantry. The pilum, the heavy javelin whose weighted iron head was designed to bend on impact so that it could not be thrown back, and so that it pulled down the shield of any enemy into whom it lodged. The gladius, the short stabbing sword of Spanish origin that was used in the close quarters fighting that followed the pilum throw, and the scutum, the large rectangular or semi-cylindrical shield that provided protection, and served as an offensive weapon in the press of close combat. The lorica segmentata, the articulated plate armour that is the most immediately recognisable element of the popular image of a Roman soldier, was the equipment of the imperial period, an innovation of the 1st century CE that replaced the earlier mail armour and chainmail that legionaries had worn in the Republic and the early Empire. The food that sustained the legions was considerably more varied and considerably more carefully organised than the popular image of Roman soldiers eating nothing but iron rations might suggest. The staple was grain, typically wheat, either ground into flour and baked into bread or crushed and boiled into porridge, supplemented by legumes, vegetables, olive oil, and the sour wine that was the universal drink of the Roman military. The legionary diet was not luxurious by any standard, but it was nutritionally adequate for the physical demands of military service and the Roman military supply system. The annona militaris, the military provision system that extracted grain from the provinces and distributed it to the frontier legions, was one of the most sophisticated logistical operations of the ancient world. Legionaries also supplemented their diet through foraging, through the purchase of additional food from the sutlers and merchants who followed every Roman army, and through the produce of the kitchen gardens that surrounded every permanent legionary fortress. Beer rather than wine was the drink of choice in Britain and Germany, where the vine did not grow and where the local grain was readily available for brewing. The pay that legionaries received, the stipendium, the cash salary that was one of the primary incentives for military service, had been set by Julius Caesar at 225 denarii per year for a common soldier, and had been increased by subsequent emperors to keep pace with inflation and to maintain the army's loyalty. From this pay, various deductions were made for food, equipment, burial club contributions and other expenses, leaving a net amount that the soldier either spent in the markets and taverns that surrounded every fortress or deposited in the unit savings bank. The Roman military maintained a form of forced saving system in which part of every soldier's pay was retained by the unit until the soldier's discharge. The saving system was one of the mechanisms by which the Roman army tried to ensure that discharged veterans had sufficient resources to establish themselves as civilians rather than becoming destitute, and the lump sum that a soldier received on completion of his 25 years of service was one of the primary attractions of military life for men from poor backgrounds. The religious life of the legion was as organised and as institutionalised as every other aspect of its existence. The Roman army maintained a liturgical calendar, a schedule of religious ceremonies, sacrifices and festivals that was observed throughout the empire by every unit simultaneously, creating a form of shared religious practice that reinforced the sense of belonging to the Roman military community across geographic distances. The calendar included celebrations of the birthdays of the divine emperors, festivals in honour of the major gods of the Roman pantheon, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva and the others who were specifically associated with military virtue and success, and specific ceremonies tied to the unit's own history and its eagle. The eagle ceremony was the most sacred, the moment when the unit's identity as a community was most directly expressed through the ritual veneration of the standard that embodied it. Beyond the official Roman religious calendar, the soldiers of the Ninth would have maintained the personal and regional religious practices that men from diverse origins brought with them. The cult of Mithras, the mystery religion of Persian origin that spread through the Roman army with unusual speed and completeness, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, left physical evidence in the form of Mithraea, the underground cult rooms, at several sites in Roman Britain. The worship of local British deities absorbed into Roman religious forms, the equation of the local water goddess Sulis with Minerva at Bath being the most famous example, was characteristic of the religious syncretism through which the Roman army managed the diverse religious traditions of the provinces it occupied. An altar to Silvanus found at York and associated with the Ninth gives a concrete physical connection between the legion and one of the most popular of the gods who appealed to soldiers in the frontier provinces, The eagle, the aquila, the golden eagle mounted on a standard that was carried by the aquilifer, the standard bearer, was the most sacred object in the legion's possession, the focus of the cult and the ritual that bound the unit together as something more than a collection of individual soldiers. The loss of the eagle in battle was the greatest catastrophe that could befall a legion, worse in some ways than the deaths of individual soldiers, because the eagle was the legion in a symbolic sense that exceeded any particular roster of men. When Publius Quinctilius Varus lost 3 legions, including their eagles, to Arminius in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE, Augustus reportedly walked the corridors of his palace for months afterward crying, "Varus, give me back my legions," the response not of a military commander lamenting casualties, but of a man who understood the symbolic destruction that the loss of the eagles represented. Conversely, the recovery of lost eagles from enemy hands was celebrated as a triumph of the First Order, and the eagles that were eventually recovered from the Germans after the Teutoburg disaster were treated with the ceremony appropriate to the return of something sacred. The 9th Legion's eagle, and what happened to it, is one of the unanswerable questions at the centre of the mystery we're here to discuss tonight. The origins of the 9th Legion are themselves somewhat obscure, as the origins of most Roman military formations tend to be, because the Roman military record-keeping of the early Republic and even the late Republic was not the systematic documentation that the Empire eventually produced, and the legions of the late Republic were raised, disbanded, and reconstituted with a frequency that makes continuous institutional identity difficult to trace. The most credible reconstruction places the 9th among the legions that Julius Caesar formed or reformed for his Gallic campaigns in the late 50s BCE. The campaigns that produced the Gallic Wars, one of the most extensively documented military operations in ancient history, because Caesar himself wrote about them in the 7 books of the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, with the precise, unemotional, third-person style of a general who was also a skilled propagandist simultaneously narrating his achievements for a Roman audience and explaining his decisions to posterity. The 9th appears in Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars, most notably at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 48 BCE during the subsequent civil war against Pompey, where Caesar describes the legion's performance with the qualified admiration that he customarily deployed to credit his soldiers while reserving the narrative's ultimate authority for himself. The civil wars of the late Republic were the crucible in which the professional Roman army of the imperial period was formed, and the legions that fought through the battles of Pharsalus, Zela, Thapsus, and Munda, the campaigns in which Caesar eliminated his rivals one after another, were being shaped by experience into the most effective military force in the Mediterranean world. The 9th was among them, accumulating the institutional knowledge and the combat experience that would make it one of the most capable formations available to the empire that Caesar's adopted son Octavian would eventually construct. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE and the subsequent civil wars that consumed the late Republic, the 9th was among the legions that Augustus, Octavian after his political transformation, inherited, reformed, and sent to the province of Hispania for the campaigns against the Cantabrian and Asturian peoples of the northwestern Iberian Peninsula. The Cantabrian Wars of 29 to 19 BCE were the last major military campaigns in Hispania, completing the Roman conquest of the Iberian Peninsula that had begun more than 2 centuries earlier, and the 9th's participation in them gave it the cognomen Hispana, by which it would be known for the remainder of its existence. The name was an honour, a badge of service in a specific campaign, in the way that military units in many cultures accumulate such designations. It identified the legion with a place and a moment that had shaped its character, and that it was expected to carry as part of its institutional identity. The 9th spent the Augustan period in Hispania, serving as part of the occupation force that maintained Roman authority in the newly pacified peninsula, and performing the garrison, road building, and administrative functions that occupied Roman legions in provinces where active campaigning had ended. This was the typical life of a Roman legion in a pacified province. Not the constant combat of the conquest phase, but the steady, grinding work of imperial maintenance, building the infrastructure of Roman civilization, suppressing the smaller uprisings that periodically broke out in even well-controlled provinces, training continuously to maintain the combat readiness that might be needed at any moment, and managing the complex relationship between the military establishment and the provincial civilian population that sustained it. It was not glamorous work, but it was the work on which the Roman Empire's existence depended. The early 1st century CE brought the ninth to a theatre considerably more demanding than peaceful Hispania. The legion was transferred to the Balkans, to the Danube frontier, that long and contested line of the great river that separated the Roman world from the Germanic and Dacian peoples to its north, and then, in approximately 43 CE, to Britain, for the Claudian invasion that would put the ninth at the centre of one of the most consequential Roman military campaigns of the 1st century. The Roman invasion of Britain under the Emperor Claudius in 43 CE landed on an island that had been in contact with the Roman world for nearly a century before the first legionaries stepped onto its shores, and understanding what that pre-conquest contact had produced, the kind of Britain that the invasion found, is essential to understanding what the 9th Legion was operating in for the century of its British service. The two expeditions that Julius Caesar had launched across the Channel in 55 and 54 BCE had been military demonstrations rather than conquests. Probes of the island's geography and military capacity that had produced some dramatic engagements with British chariot forces, a punitive campaign against the powerful Catuvelauni tribe north of the Thames, and ultimately a withdrawal to Gaul that left the political situation in Britain essentially unchanged. Caesar extracted tribute commitments from some British kings and hostages from others, but he did not leave garrisons, did not establish permanent bases, and did not attempt to incorporate Britain into the administrative structure of Roman provincial governance. What his expeditions did was establish the Roman claim to Britain as a territory within the Roman sphere, the idea that Britain was destined for eventual incorporation into the empire, and generate the flow of commercial contact between the southeastern British tribes and the Roman world that the following century of trade and diplomatic exchange intensified. The Britain that the Claudian invasion found in 43 CE was a sophisticated, politically complex and regionally diverse world that had been profoundly shaped by that century of contact with Rome. The tribal kingdoms of southeastern Britain, the Catuvelauni under Cunobelinus, the Cymbeline of Shakespeare's play, the Atrebates of the south, the Canti of Kent, had been importing Roman goods for generations: wine in amphorae, fine pottery, olive oil, glass, and the other luxury goods of the Mediterranean economy that the aristocracies of the southeastern British tribes had developed a taste for. The coins they issued show the influence of Roman numismatic traditions. Their settlements, the large proto-urban centres that Roman writers called oppida, were organised with a sophistication that reflects sustained engagement with Roman commercial and political culture. Some members of the British aristocracy had spent time in Rome, had received Roman educations, and had returned to Britain with the cultural capital that Roman connection provided. The more northerly and westerly tribes, the Brigantes of what is now Yorkshire and the Pennines, the Siluras and Ordovices of Wales, the Caledonians and Picts of Scotland, were less affected by this southern commercial engagement and retained political and social structures that were more thoroughly grounded in the pre-Roman Iron Age traditions of the island. These were the peoples that the 9th Legion would spend most of its British career in contact with. The Brigantes as the dominant force in the north, whose territory the 9th's base at York placed it at the centre of, and the Caledonians beyond the Highland line whose resistance to Roman authority had been the subject of Agricola's campaigns in the 80s CE. The Brigantes presented the Roman administration with one of the most complex of the provincial management challenges it faced in Britain, because the tribe was internally divided between a pro-Roman faction and an anti-Roman faction, whose conflict ran through the entirety of the early occupation period, and whose resolution required repeated Roman military intervention. The Brigantian queen Cartimandua was Rome's client ruler in the north, a pro-Roman leader who maintained her position with Roman support and who demonstrated her loyalty in 51 CE by handing over Caratacus, the fugitive British resistance leader who had sought refuge with her after his final defeat in Wales to the Romans. Caratacus was taken to Rome, where Claudius spared his life. The sources describe his speech to the emperor as impressively dignified, and allowed him to live out his days as a curiosity of the empire. Cartimandua's relationship with the Romans was the political framework within which the Ninth operated in the north for much of the period before the Boudican revolt, but the framework was unstable. Her divorce from her husband Venutius, whom she replaced with his armour-bearer Velocatus, a social and political scandal of the first order in the world of the northern British aristocracy, produced a civil war that required Roman military intervention on multiple occasions in the 50s and 60s. C.E. Venutius, who was anti-Roman in his politics, eventually defeated Cartimandua with sufficient completeness to take control of the Brigantian kingdom, requiring Cartimandua to be rescued by Roman forces around 69 CE during the Year of the Four Emperors, when the Roman state's attention was most thoroughly absorbed by its own succession crisis. After Cartimandua's rescue, Venutius controlled the Brigantian territory, and the Roman administration had to treat the north as hostile country, which is the political context for the aggressive Flavian campaigns into the Brigantian heartland and then into Scotland that the Ninth would be involved in. The Roman invasion of Britain under the Emperor Claudius in 43 CE was the largest amphibious military operation Rome had conducted since the Augustan campaigns, and its political motivation had as much to do with Claudius's need for military prestige as with any specific strategic requirement. Claudius was an emperor whose ascent to power had been accidental. He had been proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard after the assassination of Caligula in 41 CE, a man who had spent his entire life being excluded from public life on grounds of physical disability and intellectual eccentricity, who was widely regarded as unsuitable for power and who needed a military success to establish his legitimacy in ways that his unusual path to the throne had not provided. Britain, an island that Julius Caesar had twice invaded and twice failed to permanently occupy, that stood at the very edge of the known world in the Roman geographical imagination, that was associated with wealth in the form of grain, metal, and slaves, was the available opportunity. Claudius authorized the invasion and then sailed himself to Britain to be present for the formal submission of British kings, staying for 16 days before returning to Rome to celebrate a triumph that the Senate voted him with unusual enthusiasm. The actual military campaign was conducted by Aulus Plautius, the legate of the invasion force, with 4 legions that included the IX Hispana. The invasion force landed on the Kent coast in the summer of 43 CE. The exact landing point is still debated by archaeologists, with Richborough in Kent being the traditional candidate, and Fishbourne in West Sussex and various other sites also having scholarly advocates, and fought its way across the Thames against the forces of the British King Caratacus and his brother Togodumnus, in a series of engagements along the Medway River and the Thames that are described in fragmentary and sometimes contradictory terms by the Greek historian Cassius Dio, our primary narrative source for the invasion. The crossing of the Thames was the decisive military moment of the initial phase, and Plautius held his position there until Claudius himself arrived with elephants, the ancient world's shock weapons, whose psychological effect on populations that had never seen them could be reliably counted on, for the formal submission ceremony at Camulodunum, modern Colchester. After the initial conquest, the 4 invasion legions fanned out across southern and central Britain, each taking responsibility for a sector of the expanding occupation zone. The IX Hispana was assigned to the Eastern Midlands and eventually to the north, the territory of the Corytani and Brigantes tribes that occupied what is now Yorkshire, Lancashire, and the country up to the Scottish border. It established its fortress at Lindum, modern Lincoln, and later at Eboracum, modern York, which would become one of the most important cities of Roman Britain and the base from which the Ninth would conduct its operations in the north for the better part of a century. The fortress at York was of the standard legionary design, a playing card-shaped enclosure of approximately 50 acres, with barracks, headquarters building, granaries, hospital, baths, and all the other institutional infrastructure that a permanent legionary base required, and its remains underlie significant portions of modern York, occasionally appearing in building excavations and providing the physical evidence of the Ninth's presence that the written sources alone cannot supply. Britain was not a peaceful province in the decades following the initial conquest, and the Ninth Hispana was at the centre of some of the most serious challenges to Roman authority in the island's history. The province that Plautius and his successors were constructing was, in the manner of Roman provincial construction generally, organised around the extraction of resources and the imposition of Roman administrative systems on a population that had not been consulted about this arrangement, and that responded with varying degrees of accommodation, resistance, and everything between. The Iceni tribe of East Anglia, whose queen Boudica would eventually lead the most serious revolt in the history of Roman Britain, were in the early decades of the occupation nominally allied with Rome, their king Prasutagus having made the kind of client-king arrangement by which the Romans frequently managed newly conquered peoples, allowing local rulers to retain their authority in exchange for cooperation with Roman administration and the payment of tribute. When Prasutagus died around 60 CE, leaving his kingdom jointly to his two daughters and to the Roman emperor, the Roman administration, specifically the procurator Catus Decianus, treated the bequest as an opportunity for expropriation rather than the arrangement that Prasutagus had apparently intended. Roman officials seized the Icenian nobles' estates. Roman soldiers flogged Boudica. Her daughters were assaulted. The response of the Iceni, joined by the Trinovantes and other tribes with their own grievances against Roman rule, was a revolt of a scale that the Roman administration had entirely failed to anticipate and was initially entirely unprepared to suppress. Boudica's forces burned Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the symbolic capital of Roman Britain, killing its inhabitants, destroying the temple of the deified Claudius that was the most prominent symbol of Roman authority in the province, and defeating the detachment of the Ninth Legion that was sent to relieve it. The defeat of the Ninth's detachment in the Boudican revolt is the first of the serious military setbacks that mark the Legion's British career, and the man who commanded that detachment and who survived its destruction is one of the more interesting figures in the Ninth's story, because his subsequent career brought him back into contact with the north of Britain in a way that connects the Boudican episode to the Flavian expansion that would eventually take the Ninth to Scotland. Quintus Petillius Cerialis is one of the few figures who appears repeatedly in the British frontier story across a span of decades, and his career illustrates the specific way in which the Roman military establishment recycled its senior commanders and how the institutional memory of the army was maintained across successive crises. He commanded the Ninth's detachment that was destroyed, or more precisely whose infantry were destroyed, in the Boudican revolt around 60 CE, escaping with the cavalry while his infantry were annihilated. This was the kind of survival that required explanation in the Roman military culture, and the subsequent record suggests that Cerialis either provided a satisfactory explanation or that his social and political connections were sufficient to prevent the disaster from ending his career. He reappears in 69 CE, the year of the four emperors, when the empire went through four rulers in quick succession, and the Roman military establishment was fractured between competing claims as a general for the Flavian cause, fighting in the campaigns in northern Italy that helped Vespasian win the succession struggle. His subsequent career brought him back to Britain as governor in approximately 71 CE, now commanding the province where he had previously suffered his worst defeat. and the Flavian northern campaigns that the Ninth was involved in under his governorship were in some sense a personal redemption. His return to the territory where the disaster had occurred now with the resources and the authority to do something definitive about the Brigantian problem that the Boudican revolt period had left unresolved. Cerialis's northern campaigns in Britain established Roman authority in Brigantian territory and pushed the frontier significantly northward. The capture of the Brigantian capital Stannic in Yorkshire, the advance into the Pennines, the establishment of the road and fort network that would eventually support Agricola's further advance into Scotland were the products of his governorship. The 9th Legion was the primary instrument of these campaigns, its base at York placed at the geographic centre of the new northern military zone, and the relationship between the 9th and the Brigantian territory was defined in this period in ways that would shape its service for the remainder of its time in Britain. And it is worth dwelling on because it illustrates both the scale of the Boudican crisis and the reality of what Roman military defeat in Britain could look like. The detachment, probably around 2,000 legionaries and some cavalry under the legate Quintus Petillius Cerialis, who would reappear in the 9th story later, was ambushed somewhere in the Midlands as it marched toward Colchester and was essentially destroyed. The infantry were killed almost to a man. Cerialis escaped with his cavalry. The legion as a whole survived. It was at its base at Lincoln, but the detachment's annihilation was a significant military disaster that contributed to the general crisis until the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus could bring the main Roman force from Wales to the decisive confrontation that ended the revolt. The Boudican revolt and its suppression left marks on Roman Britain that the subsequent administration spent decades working to erase. The revolt had demonstrated that the Roman conquest was not as complete as the administrative document suggested, that the grievances of the provincial population were real and capable of generating organised violence on a scale that seriously threatened Roman authority, and that the specific forms of Roman exploitation, the debt collection, the tribute extraction, the expropriation of noble estates, that the provincial administration practiced had costs that could be catastrophic when they exceeded the population's tolerance. The post-Boudican administration of Britain under the new governors Petronius Turpilianus and Trebellius Maximus was deliberately more conciliatory, pulling back from the aggressive exploitation that had precipitated the revolt and attempting to build the kind of stable provincial order that Roman Britain eventually became in the later 1st and 2nd centuries. The 9th Legion's career in Britain through the Flavian period, the reigns of Vespasian, Titus and Domitian from 69 to 96 CE, was shaped by the continuing effort to push Roman authority northward and by the periodic need to respond to uprisings and instability in the territories already nominally under Roman control. The legion was involved in the Flavian advance into Scotland under Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the governor of Britain from 77 to 84 CE, whose campaigns are the most extensively documented of the Roman period in Britain because his son-in-law was the historian Tacitus, who wrote a biography of Agricola that provides the most detailed account we have of Roman military operations in northern Britain. Agricola's campaign in Scotland was the most ambitious Roman military operation in Britain since the initial conquest, and the account that Tacitus provides of it in the Agricola is both one of the most valuable and one of the most problematic sources for Roman military history in Britain. Valuable because it is the most extensive literary description of Roman operations in northern Britain. Problematic because its author was the subject's son-in-law, and was writing with the explicit purpose of commemorating Agricola's achievements in a political context where celebrating Agricola serves specific political purposes. Tacitus's relationship to his subject shapes the Agricola in ways that require careful reading. He was writing under Trajan after the death of the Emperor Domitian, whom Tacitus loathed, and whose recall of Agricola from Britain before he could complete his northern campaigns Tacitus presents as an act of envious suppression. The Agricola is partly a biography, partly a panegyric, partly a meditation on how a good man survives under tyrannical government, and partly a description of Roman Britain that is the most detailed literary account of the province in the 1st century CE. It is not primarily a military history in the technical sense, and Tacitus's descriptions of specific battles and campaigns, including the famous account of Mons Graupius, are written for literary and political effect rather than for the operational accuracy that a military historian would provide. The speech that Tacitus attributes to Calgacus before the Battle of Mons Graupius, the great anti-imperial speech in which the Caledonian leader describes the Romans as the robbers of the world, who when the earth has nothing left for them to plunder, scour the sea, adding that they create a desert and call it peace, is almost certainly the composition of Tacitus himself, rather than a faithful record of anything Calgacus actually said. The speech contains some of the most powerful anti-imperial rhetoric in ancient literature, and it reads as the work of a Roman intellectual reflecting critically on the nature of Roman expansion, not as the indigenous voice of a Scottish chieftain filtered through centuries of transmission. But as rhetoric it is extraordinary, and the line ubi solitudinem faciunt, pacem appellant, where they make a desert, they call it peace, has been quoted in the context of every subsequent empire the world has produced. The specific location of the Battle of Mons Graupius, where Agricola's forces defeated the combined Caledonian army in the campaign's climactic engagement, has been debated by historians and archaeologists for centuries, with candidates ranging from sites in Perthshire to Aberdeenshire to the far northeast of Scotland. The name Mons Graupius, the Groupian mountain, may have given rise to the term Grampians for the Scottish mountain range, or the reverse, and the etymological connection is another of those intriguing historical questions that can be discussed at length without being conclusively resolved. The most recent archaeological survey work has focused on sites in northeast Scotland, particularly the area around Benatchy in Aberdeenshire, where a large Roman marching camp at Durno, large enough to have housed the entire Agricolan field army, has been identified as a strong candidate for the campaign's final stage. The 9th Legion had a prominent and, for readers of Sutcliffe's novel, memorable moment in Agricola's Scottish campaigns. In one of the episodes that Tacitus describes, set during what appears to be the campaign season immediately preceding Mons Graupius, the Caledonian forces attacked the 9th camp at night while the legion was encamped separately from the rest of the army. The attack penetrated the camp's defences, and for a time the situation was genuinely dangerous before Agricola sent relief forces that attacked the Caledonians from behind and drove them off. Tacitus describes the episode with a literary skill that emphasises both the danger and the recovery. The darkened camp, the fighting in the confusion of the night, the relief force arriving at dawn to turn the battle. And it was this episode, more than any other documented event in the 9th's history, that became the kernel of the romantic legend that Rosemary Sutcliffe and others developed into the full story of the Legion's disappearance in Scotland. But the 9th did not disappear in Scotland in Agricola's time. It survived the night attack, it fought at Mons Graupius, it returned south when Agricola's campaigns ended, as they did when Domitian recalled him, and eventually withdrew the forces that had been pushed to the Highland frontier, the classic Roman pattern of overextension followed by consolidation. The 9th was still at York, still functioning, still leaving the inscriptions and building records that are the primary evidence of its continued existence. The Agricola episode is the specific historical episode that Sutcliffe used as the seed for her novel, extrapolating from the night attack to imagine a scenario in which the 9th was eventually destroyed or captured somewhere in Scotland. The novel's premise, that the 9th marched into Scotland, was defeated by the Caledonians and that its eagle standard was captured and hidden somewhere in the Highlands, is a beautifully realised imaginative elaboration of a real historical question, but it conflates two separate historical moments. The night attack during Agricola's campaigns in the 80s CE, when the 9th demonstrably survived, and the subsequent disappearance of the ninth from the record sometime in the early 2nd century, which is the actual mystery. The conflation is what makes the Scotland theory so compelling as narrative and so problematic as history. The epigraphic evidence, the inscriptions on stone that are the primary surviving record of the Roman military presence in Britain, tells a more precise and more complicated story about the 9th Legion's final documented presence in Britain than the Romantic narrative suggests. The last securely dated inscription attributing construction work to the 9th Hispana in Britain comes from York and dates to approximately 108 CE, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. This inscription records the reconstruction of the fortress's main gate and headquarters building in stone. The replacement of earlier timber construction with the permanent stone structures that indicate a unit's long-term commitment to a location. A unit that was about to march off to destruction in Scotland would not typically be investing in the stone reconstruction of its home base. There is a second inscription from around the same period that shows the 9th at Nijmegen in the Netherlands, the Roman military base at Noviomagus on the Rhine frontier, and this inscription is critical to the scholarly debate because it places the 9th outside Britain entirely at a point that overlaps with or follows the last British evidence. The Nijmegen tile stamps bearing the 9th's mark were identified in the late 20th century and have been the subject of considerable scholarly discussion because they suggest that at least a significant detachment of the 9th was serving on the Rhine frontier in the early 2nd century, which is not where the Scotland theory places the legion at the time of its supposed annihilation. The question of what happened to the 9th after the early 2nd century is where the scholarly debate becomes most interesting and most unsettled, because the evidence that survives is fragmentary enough to support several different reconstructions without definitively excluding any of them. The main possibilities that scholars have seriously considered are these: the 9th was destroyed in Britain in a military catastrophe that the surviving literary sources do not document clearly. The 9th was destroyed in one of the eastern campaigns of the 2nd century. The Jewish revolt of 132 to 135 CE under Bar Kokhba, or the Parthian campaigns of the same period, or some other eastern disaster. The 9th was disbanded, deliberately dissolved by the imperial administration for reasons that the surviving sources do not record, and its men distributed to other units, or some combination of these, with the legion's strength reduced by one disaster and then finished off or disbanded following another. The evidence that bears on these possibilities comes from several different types of source, each with its own limitations and its own value. The literary sources, the histories, the biographies, the administrative correspondence that the Roman world produced in substantial quantity, are the most immediately readable but the least complete for the specific question of the 9th's fate, because the Roman literary tradition was not primarily concerned with the institutional histories of individual legions, and because the periods when the 9th would have disappeared are periods for which the literary record is less complete than for either the earlier or the later empire. The epigraphic evidence, the inscriptions, is more reliable in what it specifically attests, but limited by the accidents of what has survived. Only a fraction of the inscriptions that were made in the Roman period have been found, and the ones that have been found reflect the accidents of geography, soil chemistry, later construction, and archaeological investigation rather than a representative sample of everything that existed. The archaeological evidence of physical remains, the fortresses, the camps, the associated artifact assemblages, can tell us about patterns of occupation and abandonment, but cannot usually tell us why those patterns changed. What the literary sources do provide, tantalizingly, is a reference that suggests significant military trouble in Britain in the early years of Hadrian's reign, approximately 117 to 122 CE. The Historia Augusta, the late antique collection of imperial biographies whose reliability on specific details is perpetually debated, says that when Hadrian came to power, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control, a phrase that implies either a major revolt or a military defeat, or some combination of serious difficulties on the British frontier. Fronto, the Roman advocate and literary figure who was tutor to the future Emperor Marcus Aurelius, mentions in one of his surviving letters that significant numbers of Roman soldiers were killed in Britain during this period, describing it in terms that suggest a serious military setback rather than routine frontier skirmishing. These references are frustratingly vague about the specific military events they allude to, but together they suggest that something went significantly wrong in Britain in the years around 117 to 122 CE, exactly the period when the ninth disappears from the British epigraphic record, and when Hadrian decided to build a wall across northern England that bears his name. Hadrian's wall itself is perhaps the most significant indirect evidence bearing on the question of what happened in northern Britain in this period, and the specific character of the wall as a military and political achievement deserves careful examination, because the decisions embodied in its construction tell us things about the situation that generated it that the literary sources do not say explicitly. The decision to build a permanent fixed frontier across northern Britain was not, by the standards of Roman strategic thinking in the early 2nd century, an obvious one. The dominant tradition of Roman frontier management in the 1st and early 2nd centuries had been one of relatively fluid frontier zones, controlled through a combination of client kingdoms, military roads and forts, and the periodic display of military force, rather than the fixed linear barriers that Hadrian's wall represents. The earlier frontier system in Britain had consisted of a road, the Stainget running from Carlisle to Corbridge, with forts along its length and a network of watchtowers and smaller posts that allowed communication and response across the frontier zone. This system was flexible in ways that a stone wall is not, and the decision to replace it with a permanent stone structure of unprecedented scale reflected a specific judgment about the situation in the north that the Stainget system was no longer adequate to manage. The engineering of Hadrian's wall reflects a sophisticated understanding of military architecture and frontier control that went well beyond simply building a line of stone across the landscape. The combination of the wall itself, the ditch on its northern face, the vallum on its southern face, and the fort system along its length created a multi-layered controlled zone that managed movement across the frontier rather than simply preventing it. The gates in the mile castles could be opened to allow passage north and south under controlled conditions, and the actual military function of the wall was probably as much about regulation and taxation of cross-frontier movement as about military defence in the conventional sense. Walls do not stop armies. The Romans knew this perfectly well, and the wall was never designed to stop a full-scale Caledonian invasion. It was designed to control the kind of small-scale raiding, unauthorised movement and political disruption that the northern frontier had apparently been experiencing. What had the northern frontier been experiencing in the years before the wall's construction? The literary sources, as we have noted, are frustratingly vague, but the combination of Fronto's reference to Roman casualties in Britain under Hadrian and the archaeological evidence for significant military construction in the period 117 to 122 CE suggest that the situation was serious. Some archaeologists have pointed to evidence of destruction at several northern forts in this period, evidence of burning, of abandonment, of the kind of physical disruption that hostile action produces in the archaeological record. The evidence is not uniform and its interpretation is contested, but the suggestion is that the years between Trajan's death in 117 and the beginning of wall construction around 122 CE saw serious military activity on the northern frontier, activity serious enough to require not just military response but a fundamental rethinking of the frontier management strategy. It is in this context that the question of what happened to the ninth is most usefully placed. Whatever occurred in the north of Britain in those years, and something did occur, something that the sources describe in terms that indicate real military difficulty, The 9th Legion was the unit that had been based at York and responsible for the northern sector of British frontier defence. The coincidence of the 9th's disappearance with a period of military crisis in the north is the strongest argument for the Britain hypothesis, even in the absence of the specific physical evidence that would confirm it. In this period, the decision to build a permanent stone barrier from coast to coast across the narrowest part of northern England, from Bowness-on-Solway in the west to Wallsend in the east, a distance of approximately 73 miles, was not a decision that Roman imperial policy took lightly or cheaply. Building Hadrian's Wall required an enormous investment of labour, materials and logistical resources, and it represented a fundamental strategic decision. That Roman authority would not be extended further north, that the Caledonian highlands beyond the wall were not worth the cost of further military campaigns, and that the frontier of the Roman province would be held at this line rather than pushed to the more northerly positions that Agricola had briefly achieved. Wall building of this scale and permanence was the Roman Empire's way of saying that a problem was real, persistent, and significant enough to justify a permanent architectural solution. Whatever had happened in northern Britain in the years just before the wall's construction, and the scholarly consensus is that the wall was begun in approximately 122 CE, when Hadrian visited Britain in person, was serious enough to prompt one of the largest construction projects in the history of the British Isles. The combination of the literary references to serious military trouble in Britain around 117 to 122 CE and the disappearance of the 9th from the British evidence in the same period has naturally led scholars to consider whether the 9th was involved in whatever military disaster the literary sources are referring to. The difficulty is that the literary sources are not specific enough about the events to allow confident reconstruction of what happened, and the archaeological evidence for a catastrophic military defeat of a Roman legion somewhere in northern Britain has not materialised despite extensive survey and excavation. The mass grave, the destroyed weapons cache, the burned fort, the physical signatures of a military catastrophe that the archaeological record should show if the 9th was annihilated in Britain, have not been found. This absence is not conclusive. The northern British landscape has not been uniformly surveyed to the standard that would reliably detect all the physical evidence of a major Roman military disaster, and the specific circumstances of such a disaster, the location, the season, the subsequent behaviour of the victors, would determine whether the evidence was the kind that survives in the ground for 2,000 years. But the absence is a real consideration for historians trying to evaluate the Scotland theory, and it contributes to the growing scholarly tendency to look elsewhere for the 9th's fate. The eastern alternative, the possibility that the 9th was destroyed not in Britain but in one of the military disasters of the East in the 2nd century, gains its plausibility from the specific character of the crisis that accompanied the transition from Trajan to Hadrian in 117 CE. An understanding that transition requires understanding what Trajan had been doing with the Roman army in the preceding decade. Trajan's reign from 98 to 117 CE was defined by military expansion on a scale that the Roman Empire had not seen since Augustus, and that ran in two main directions: the Dacian Wars that resulted in the creation of the province of Dacia across the Danube, the wars commemorated on Trajan's column in Rome, whose spiral of carved reliefs remains one of the most detailed visual records of Roman military operations in existence, and the Parthian War that was the Great Eastern project of his final years. The Dacian Wars, fought in two campaigns in 101 to 102 and 105 to 106 CE, were conventional campaigns in the sense that they were conducted against a specific kingdom with a specific capital, culminating in the capture of Sarmizegetusa, the Dacian capital, and the suicide of the Dacian king Decebalus. The silver and gold of Dacian mines that the conquest opened poured into the Roman treasury in quantities that funded the construction program and the grain distributions that made Trajan one of the most popular emperors of the 2nd century. The Parthian War was more ambitious and ultimately less successful. Beginning in 114 CE, Trajan launched the largest Roman military operation since Augustus, aiming at the permanent conquest of the Parthian Empire, the great Iranian-based power that had been Rome's eastern rival for 2 centuries, and that controlled Mesopotamia and the trade routes to the further east. By 116 CE, Trajan had captured the Parthian capital Ctesiphon, had reached the Persian Gulf, and had organised the new provinces of Armenia, Mesopotamia and Assyria. He was, briefly, the Roman emperor with the greatest territorial extent in the empire's history. Then everything fell apart simultaneously. The eastern provinces erupted in the Great Jewish Revolt of 115 to 117 CE, the Kitos War, named for Lucius Quietus, the general Trajan tasked with its suppression. The Jewish diaspora communities of Egypt, Cyprus, Cyrenaica and Mesopotamia rose in coordinated uprisings that were characterized by violence on a scale that shocked even the Roman sources, which were not known for particular sympathy to the provincial perspective. The Cyrenaic revolt was particularly severe, resulting in the deaths of enormous numbers of non-Jewish inhabitants of the province and the destruction of the city of Cyrene itself. Egypt was seriously destabilized. Cyprus was, according to the sources, depopulated of non-Jewish inhabitants. The Roman response required military forces from multiple provinces and resulted in mass killings of Jewish populations across the affected regions that the Talmudic tradition preserves in the category of catastrophic persecution. While the Jewish revolts were consuming military resources in the east, Parthia counterattacked. The newly created provinces of Mesopotamia and Assyria were abandoned almost immediately. The populations were unwilling to accept Roman rule, and the Parthian military pressure was sufficient to make holding them impossible, without resources that the simultaneous Jewish revolts had absorbed. Trajan himself, whose health had been deteriorating throughout the eastern campaigns, died in August 117 CE at Selinus in Cilicia, while returning westward to deal with the multiple crises that his eastern adventure had produced. He left his successor Hadrian an empire that was strategically extended beyond what could be securely held, militarily exhausted from a decade of intensive campaigning and dealing with serious revolts or instabilities on multiple frontiers simultaneously. Hadrian's response was immediate and consequential. He abandoned the eastern conquests, accepting a Parthian settlement that restored the pre-Trajan borders, suppressed the ongoing revolts with whatever military forces were available, and began the systematic reorganization of the empire's frontier defences that Hadrian's Wall represents the most famous expression of. This reorganization, the decision that the empire's frontiers should be fixed, defended and held rather than continuously advanced, was one of the most significant strategic decisions in Roman history, and it was made in the specific context of the crisis of 117 CE and the recognition that the previous century of expansion had produced an empire that was strategically overextended. It is in this context, the crisis of 117 CE, the multiple simultaneous emergencies across multiple frontiers, the need for military units to be shuffled rapidly between theatres, and the specific military disasters that the period generated, that the disappearance of the 9th Legion falls. The timing could not be more precise or more suggestive. The 9th disappears from the record exactly as the empire enters the most serious crisis it had faced since the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE. Whether the 9th was among the casualties of that crisis, in Britain, in the East, or somewhere else entirely, is the question that the evidence cannot answer. In the 2nd century has gained significant scholarly support in recent decades, and the evidence for it deserves careful examination. The Parthian War of 114 to 117 CE, which Trajan launched and which included the deepest Roman penetration into Parthian territory since Crassus had been defeated at Carrhae in 53 BCE, was followed by a massive Parthian counter-offensive and a general uprising in the eastern provinces, that killed enormous numbers of Roman soldiers and required Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan in 117 CE, to abandon most of what Trajan had gained. The Jewish revolt of 115 to 117 CE, known as the Kitos War, affecting the large Jewish diaspora communities of Egypt, Cyrene, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia, was another serious military crisis of exactly this period, requiring Roman military resources in the east, at the moment when the empire was already under severe pressure from Parthia. The Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE, the third and most devastating of the Jewish revolts against Roman rule, was the most serious military crisis of Hadrian's reign and one of the most serious military engagements of the entire 2nd century. The revolt, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, who established a short-lived independent Jewish state in Judea and whose forces inflicted significant casualties on the Roman legions that were initially sent against it, required the Roman general Julius Severus to be transferred from Britain to Judea, specifically to deal with the military situation, which tells you something about the scale of the problem. The Roman reconquest of Judea was costly. Several legions suffered serious losses. The province of Judea was renamed Syria Palestina after the revolt's suppression, in a deliberate Roman attempt to erase the Jewish identity of the territory. The question of whether the IX Hispana was among the legions deployed to the east and destroyed there has been argued by several scholars, most notably Lawrence Keppy, whose work on the Roman army in Britain is among the most authoritative available, and more recently Adrian Goldsworthy, whose broad survey of the question has given the Eastern hypothesis wider circulation. The arguments in favour of the Eastern hypothesis rest primarily on two observations. First, that the ninth disappears from the record at a point when the Eastern legionary establishment was under severe pressure, and when the destruction of units is documented, even if not always by name, and second, that the silence of the British sources after approximately 108 CE, combined with the Nijmegen evidence placing the ninth on the Rhine, suggests that the legion may have left Britain before whatever happened to it, rather than having been destroyed on British soil. The arguments against the Eastern hypothesis rest on the absence of positive evidence. There is no inscription, no document, no clear literary reference that places the ninth Hispana in the east, and the destruction of a unit as well established as the ninth would normally generate some documentation in the administrative records that the Roman army produced in large quantities. The argument from silence cuts both ways. The absence of evidence for the Eastern hypothesis is no more conclusive than the absence of physical evidence for the Britain hypothesis, and the scholarly debate continues without resolution. There is a third possibility that the popular narrative almost entirely ignores, and that is the possibility that the Ninth Legion was not destroyed at all, but was deliberately disbanded. Roman emperors disbanded legions, occasionally for various reasons. Loss of a battle standard was traditionally grounds for disbandment, as was a unit's participation in a revolt against a legitimate emperor, and there may have been other administrative or political reasons for dissolving a unit that the surviving sources do not document. The disbandment hypothesis does not explain the disappearance of the ninth in the sense of accounting for all 5,000 of its soldiers, but it accounts for the institutional disappearance, the cessation of new inscriptions, the absence from subsequent unit lists, in a way that is at least administratively coherent. Units were not dissolved all at once. Their men were transferred to other units or discharged at the end of their service, and the institutional entities simply ceased to be organised under that designation. The specific trigger for a potential disbandment could have been the events in Britain around 117 CE, if the legion was badly mauled in a military engagement and then dissolved rather than reconstituted, as happened to other legions at various points in Roman history, or it could have been a political decision related to the legion's behaviour during one of the succession crises of the 2nd century, or it could have been a simple administrative reorganisation that the surviving sources happen not to document clearly. The disbandment hypothesis has the advantage of not requiring a specific catastrophic event that the archaeological record has failed to reveal, but it has the disadvantage of not being directly supported by any surviving evidence either. The honest answer that scholarship has arrived at with increasing confidence across the late 20th and early 21st centuries is that we do not know what happened to the Ninth Legion, and that the available evidence is insufficient to determine whether the Scotland theory, the Eastern theory, or the disbandment theory is correct, or whether the truth is some combination or variation of all three. What scholarship has done, with considerable confidence, is established that the Scotland theory in its specific romantic form, the legion marching north into the mist and being wiped out by Caledonians beyond Hadrian's Wall, is almost certainly wrong, or at least not supported by the available evidence, and that the actual mystery is considerably more geographically and temporally diffuse than the popular narrative suggests. This does not make the mystery less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because a mystery that cannot be solved by consulting the available evidence is a mystery that opens onto the genuine limits of what historical inquiry can establish, and those limits are themselves historically revealing. The silence of the sources about what happened to the Ninth is, among other things, evidence of how much we do not know about the Roman world, how much of the administrative documentation, how many of the inscriptions, how many of the historical accounts were lost in the 1500 years between the height of the Roman Empire and the scholars who began trying to reconstruct it. The physical landscape of Roman Britain that the Ninth occupied has yielded, across the centuries of archaeological investigation that began in a systematic way in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that continues today with increasingly sophisticated methods, a series of finds that bring the legion's presence into physical focus even while the question of its fate remains open. The fortress at York, Eboracum, was the Ninth's primary home for most of its British service, and the remains of the Roman city that grew up around and beyond the legionary fortress are among the most extensive and most studied Roman archaeological sites in Britain. The multangular tower that still stands in the museum gardens in York is part of the circuit of the later Roman fortress walls, and while it postdates the Ninth's presence, it sits on the foundations of the earlier work that the Ninth soldiers built when they reconstructed the fortress in stone in the early 2nd century. The inscriptions that the Ninth left at York and at other sites along the northern frontier of Roman Britain are among the most personal surviving records of the legion's existence, not the institutional history that the military registers would have contained, but the individual human voices of soldiers who paid for altar stones to their gods, who commemorated their service in stone, who mark their presence in the specific and now fragmented way that epigraphic culture preserved. An altar to Silvanus dedicated by a soldier of the Ninth found at York, a tile stamp bearing the mark of the Ninth, Legio IX Hispana, or its abbreviations, found at York and at other sites in the north, a funerary inscription for one Lucius Duxius Rufinus, standard-bearer of the Ninth, found in York, which is one of the most evocative single finds associated with the Legion. A man who carried the standards of the Ninth, whose face we cannot see, whose specific fate within the larger fate of the unit we cannot know, but whose name and role were important enough to someone to be carved in stone and left for us to find 2,000 years later. The wider distribution of Ninth Legion inscriptions across Britain reveals the geographic extent of the unit's activities beyond its York base. Stamped tiles and inscriptions have been found at Lincoln, the Ninth's earlier base, at Carlisle and other sites along the road system that connected the northern frontier, and at various points along what would eventually become the line of Hadrian's Wall. The tile stamps are particularly valuable because they were produced in large quantities for building projects, and they carry the unit designation clearly, allowing archaeologists to trace the Ninth's construction activities across the province with a precision that the literary sources could not provide. The specific archaeology of the frontier zone, the area between Hadrian's Wall and the Highland line of Scotland, The territory that the Ninth would have been operating in during its northern campaigns has been intensively surveyed in recent decades using aerial photography, LiDAR scanning, and geophysical prospection methods that reveal the outlines of Roman military features in the landscape without requiring excavation. The results have clarified the extent of the Roman military presence in Scotland, and have demonstrated that it was more extensive and more organised than earlier scholarship had sometimes assumed. The Romans built a substantial network of forts, watch towers, and road stations across lowland Scotland during the Agricolan period, and many of these are now visible as crop marks and soil anomalies in the aerial record even after 2,000 years of ploughing and development. But none of this archaeology has produced the specific evidence, the mass grave, the destruction deposit, the concentration of 9th Legion equipment that would confirm a catastrophic military defeat of the unit in Britain. The absence is not definitive, but it is suggestive. The story of Hadrian's Wall, which is so closely connected to the story of the 9th Legion, deserves its own attention because it is one of the most remarkable construction achievements in Roman history, and because the relationship between the wall and the 9th's disappearance, whatever that relationship ultimately was, gives it a specific resonance for tonight's story. Hadrian himself visited Britain in approximately 122 CE, the visit that is associated with the decision to build the wall, and his personal involvement in the project reflects the seriousness with which he took the British situation. Hadrian was one of the most personally engaged of the Roman emperors in the military and administrative details of his empire. His reign was defined by his extraordinary travels, visiting nearly every province in person, inspecting the frontier defences, meeting the legions, and making the direct assessments of military and administrative situations that the administrative structure of the empire did not always ensure were made at the top. The wall that Hadrian ordered was not, in its original conception, exactly the structure that survives today. The original design specified a wall of turf in the western section and stone in the eastern section, approximately 10 Roman feet thick and at least 15 feet high, with a ditch in front of it on the northern side and a flat-bottomed ditch, the vallum, behind it on the southern side that defined a military zone extending back from the wall itself. There were mile castles, small fortified gates through the wall at approximately 1 mile intervals, and turrets between them that provided observation posts and communication positions along the entire length of the frontier. The design was modified during construction, with the turf section eventually rebuilt in stone and the thickness of the stone sections reduced from the original 10 feet to approximately 8, and a series of full-scale forts was added to the wall itself at Chesters, Housesteads, Burdeswold, and several other positions, that gave it a permanent garrison capability rather than the system of rapid response from rear forts that the original design had implied. The 3 legions that built Hadrian's Wall, the 2nd Augusta from its base at Caerleon in Wales, the 6th Victrix which had recently arrived from the Rhine to replace the 9th at York, and the 20th Valeria Victrix from Chester, left their building records in inscriptions along the wall that allow archaeologists to determine which century of which legion built which section. The presence of the 6th Victrix at York, having apparently replaced the 9th at the legion's traditional northern base, is one of the pieces of evidence that suggests the 9th was gone from Britain before the wall's construction began, rather than having been destroyed in the events that preceded it. If the 9th had been destroyed in Britain around 117 to 122 CE, we might expect to see it involved in the wall's construction, or to see a clear reference to its replacement. Instead, we simply see the 6th Victrix in its place, as if the administrative substitution had already been completed by the time the wall project began. The 6th Victrix remained at York for the rest of the Roman period in Britain, for 3 centuries after the 9th's disappearance, and the fortress at York that the 9th had built became the 6th's home, whose later phases of construction overlay and in many places replaced the 9th's earlier work. Constantine the Great was proclaimed emperor at York in 306 CE, nearly 2 centuries after the Ninth's disappearance, in the same fortress complex that the Ninth had established and the Sixth had maintained. The continuity of the site across the centuries of Roman occupation gives a specific kind of poignancy to the Ninth's disappearance. The place it created outlasted it by centuries. The institution it built was inhabited by successors who may have known nothing of the specific history of the legion that had built the walls around them. Before we turn to the cultural afterlife of the Ninth Legion, there is one more piece of the historical puzzle that deserves attention. The Antonine Wall, built approximately 20 years after Hadrian's Wall, which throws interesting light on the question of what the Roman administration understood about the northern frontier in the mid-2nd century. The Antonine Wall was built around 142 CE, under the Emperor Antoninus Pius, across the narrow waste of Scotland between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, a line approximately 40 miles long, roughly 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall. It was built of turf rather than stone, on a stone foundation, with a series of forts along its length, and it represented a re-advance of the Roman frontier northward, a reversal, however temporary, of the strategic decision that Hadrian's Wall had embodied. The Antonine Wall essentially abandoned the Hadrianic frontier and re-established Roman authority over the lowland Scottish zone that Agricola had briefly controlled and that the post-Agricolan withdrawal had relinquished. The decision to build the Antonine Wall is puzzling in the context of the Ninth Legion's disappearance, because it suggests that the military situation in Scotland had stabilised sufficiently by 142 CE for Roman forces to advance northward and hold a more advanced line. If the Ninth had been destroyed by Caledonians in a catastrophic defeat somewhere in Scotland in approximately 117 CE, the ability of Roman forces to advance north again within 25 years suggests either that the Caledonian threat had been definitively addressed in the intervening period, or that the defeat of the Ninth, if it occurred, had not been as militarily consequential as the legend implies. Empires that have just suffered a catastrophic defeat in a particular theatre do not typically advance back into that theatre a generation later, unless the threat that produced the defeat has been dealt with. The Antonine Wall itself was not held for long. Archaeological evidence suggests that it was abandoned, possibly twice, with a period of reoccupation between 2 withdrawals. By the 160s CE, when Roman forces retreated to the Hadrianic line that would serve as the effective northern boundary of Roman Britain for the remainder of the occupation. The reasons for the abandonment of the Antonine Wall are not entirely clear from the surviving sources, but they probably include a combination of military pressure from the northern tribes and the strategic assessment that the more northerly frontier was too expensive to maintain relative to the military and economic value of the territory it protected. Hadrian's Wall, recommissioned as the primary frontier after the Antonine withdrawal, remained the effective northern boundary of Roman Britain until the Roman withdrawal from the island in the early 5th century. The Antonine Wall episode suggests that the Scottish frontier was contested and dynamic throughout the 2nd century, that the Roman administration was actively experimenting with its northern boundary, advancing when conditions allowed and withdrawing when they did not, and that the disappearance of the Ninth should be understood within this context of ongoing frontier instability, rather than as a single catastrophic event that defined the northern situation permanently. The cultural afterlife of the Ninth Legion, the way in which the mystery of its fate has been elaborated, imagined and reimagined by successive generations of writers, filmmakers and storytellers, is itself a historical phenomenon worth taking seriously, because it tells us something about what the mystery means to people who are drawn to it, and why it continues to generate creative responses that the historical evidence alone cannot explain. Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth, published in 1954, is the most influential single work in the Ninth Legion's cultural afterlife, and it is worth understanding what Sutcliffe did with the historical material and why it worked so powerfully. Sutcliffe was writing for young adults, and she understood her audience's need for a story with a hero and a quest, and a clear moral stakes that the historical mystery, in its actual form, did not provide. She invented Marcus Flavius Aquila, a young Roman officer whose father commanded the Ninth when it disappeared, who travels north of the Wall disguised as a Greek oculist with his British slave Esca to find the Eagle of the Ninth and restore his family's honour. The novel is beautifully written. Sutcliffe's prose style combines historical specificity with emotional directness in ways that make the Roman world feel genuinely inhabited rather than merely reconstructed, and the specific quality of her imagining of Roman Britain north of the Wall, the landscape and the people and the specific texture of a world at the edge of what Rome could control, is one of the great achievements of British historical fiction. What Sutcliffe did for the mystery was to give it a shape and a resolution that the historical evidence does not provide. She said the Ninth went north, was defeated, and the Eagle was hidden among the epidii of the Scottish Highlands, and she resolved the uncertainty by an act of imaginative closure. The resolution she provided was fictional, but it was so well imagined and so satisfying as narrative that it became, for generations of readers, the framework through which they approached the historical question, which is one of the ways that good historical fiction both serves and complicates the understanding of its subjects. The 2011 film The Eagle, based on Sutcliffe's novel, extended the story's cultural reach while also demonstrating the specific challenges of translating the novel's particular virtues to the screen. The film's Scotland, shot in the Scottish Highlands and in Hungary, with a landscape that emphasises the wildness and the remoteness of the territory beyond the Wall, captures something of the geographical imagination that drives the story, even if the historical scholarship of the intervening 60 years between Sutcliffe's novel and the film's production had substantially complicated the question of whether the Scotland setting was historically appropriate. Other fictional treatments have taken different approaches to the material. Simon Scarrow's Eagle series of Roman military fiction includes extensive treatment of the Ninth's period in Britain. Ben Kane's novels about the invasion period. The various documentary films and television series that have examined the question, typically structured as detective stories, in which the available evidence is presented and interpreted by archaeologists and historians who reach different conclusions. These cultural productions collectively represent an enormous investment of creative and scholarly energy in a question that the evidence cannot settle, which suggests that the mystery functions for the modern imagination as something more than a historical puzzle. It functions as a meditation on the limits of knowledge, on the way that empires and institutions and entire communities of people can simply vanish from the record, on the specific kind of loss that occurs when the documentary infrastructure of a civilization stops preserving the stories of the people it was supposed to represent. The broader question of Roman military defeats, that the historical sources obscure or minimize, is best understood through specific comparison with the cases where we do know what happened to destroyed or disbanded Roman legions, because the comparison illuminates both the precedent for a legion's institutional death and the specific oddness of the Ninth silence. The most famous case of a Roman legion's destruction, the 3 legions lost by Varus in the Teutoburg forest, is famous precisely because it is so thoroughly documented. The legions numbered 17, 18, and 19 were destroyed in September 9 CE when Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman army and understood its methods, led 3 legions and their auxiliary forces into an ambush in the forest of the Teutoburg in what is now Lower Saxony, killing approximately 15,000 to 20,000 men over 3 days of fighting in terrain that Roman military formation could not effectively operate in. The psychological impact on Augustus and on the Roman world was enormous. The 3 legion numbers were never reused in the subsequent history of the Roman army, a unique honour or rather dishonour, and the episode was documented by multiple contemporary and near-contemporary sources with a detail that leaves little ambiguity about what happened, where, or why. We know the name of the commander, we know the name of the Germanic leader, we know the approximate location, which has been confirmed by the discovery of a major Roman military disaster site at Kalkries near Osnabrück in Lower Saxony, a site whose artefact assemblage of Roman military equipment, human and animal bones, and coins matches the literary description of the Teutoburg disaster with remarkable precision. The Teutoburg case is instructive for the Ninth Legion mystery, because it demonstrates what the documentary and physical record of a military catastrophe looks like when the sources are adequate to preserve it. The contrast with the Ninth's silence is stark. The Ninth had been a functioning legion for over a century in Britain, with deep roots in the provincial administrative record, and its disappearance generates nothing like the literary anguish and documentary richness of the Teutoburg disaster. This could mean that the Ninth's end was less dramatic, a gradual attrition, a disbandment, a defeat too minor or too geographically remote to generate the literary attention that the Teutoburg received. Or it could mean that the Ninth's end occurred at a moment when the literary record is particularly thin and the physical evidence has not survived in recognisable form. Both are genuine possibilities. The legion numbered 22nd Deuteriana provides an interesting parallel for the Ninth's case. The 22nd Legion, originally formed from the personal army of the Galatian king Deiotarus, absorbed into the Roman army and eventually given permanent status, is documented in Egypt in the 1st century CE and then disappears from the record in exactly the same period as the 9th, the early to mid-2nd century. The most likely explanation for the 22nd's disappearance is destruction in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE. The revolt is known to have inflicted severe casualties on the Roman legion sent against it, and the 22nd's last attestation places it in the eastern province. The parallel case is significant for the Ninth story, because it demonstrates that legions could and did disappear from the record during the eastern conflicts of the 2nd century, without the specific documentation of their destruction that the Teutoburg case provides. If the 22nd can vanish in the east without a clear literary memorial, the 9th could have done the same. The disbandment of legions provides yet another comparison. The legion numbered 3 Cyrenaica was disbanded and reconstituted multiple times over the course of Roman history. The legion numbered 4 Macedonica was disbanded by Vespasian after its participation in a revolt. The legion numbered 16th Flavia was disbanded and reconstituted as the 16th Flavia Firma after a similar disgrace. These disbandments are documented, not always in great detail, but the fact of the disbandment is recorded somewhere in the surviving sources, which makes the complete silence about the 9th's disbandment, if that is what happened, slightly more puzzling. Disbandments were administrative acts that generated documentation, and the absence of any administrative record of the 9th's dissolution is one of the reasons that the disbandment hypothesis is less straightforwardly satisfying than it might initially appear. The broader question of Roman military defeats that the historical sources obscure or minimize is relevant to the 9th Legion's mystery, because it contextualizes the possibility that a significant military catastrophe could occur without leaving the clear documentary trail that modern historical expectations would predict. The Roman literary tradition was not indifferent to Roman military defeats. The Teutoburg forest disaster of 9 CE, in which Varus lost 3 legions to Arminius, was documented extensively and agonized over for generations. But the Roman historiographical tradition was also shaped by the political context in which it operated, and the systematic documentation of defeats that reflected badly on the imperial administration or that contradicted the official narrative of Roman military dominance was not a consistent priority. Emperors who suppressed information about military setbacks, historians who framed defeats as temporary tactical setbacks rather than strategic disasters, administrative documents that simply ceased to be maintained when the units they documented ceased to exist. These were real features of the Roman information environment, and they help explain why the disappearance of a unit as significant as the 9th Legion could occur without generating the clear documentary trail that we might expect. the specific period in which the ninth disappears, the late Trajanic and early Hadrianic period, approximately 110 to 125 CE, was a period of significant military pressure across multiple frontiers simultaneously, in which the imperial administration was managing serious crises in Britain, on the Danube, in the east, and in the provinces of the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The administrative capacity to produce and preserve the kind of detailed documentation that would tell us exactly what happened to every unit affected by these crises was not infinite, and the physical survival of whatever documentation was produced across the subsequent 18 centuries depended on accidents of geography, material, and human behaviour that were not uniform across the Roman world. The papyri from Egypt that preserve some of the most detailed Roman military administrative records survive because Egyptian conditions, arid, stable, are unusually favourable for the preservation of organic materials. The wooden writing tablets and papyrus documents from Britain have survived in waterlogged conditions at specific sites like Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall, but the sample they represent is tiny relative to the total documentation that Roman military administration in Britain must have produced. The Vindolanda tablets, discovered in the waterlogged remains of successive wooden barrack buildings at the fort of Vindolanda just south of Hadrian's Wall, deserve considerably more attention than a passing mention, because they are not merely interesting historical documents, but one of the most humanly direct windows into the daily reality of the Roman military frontier that archaeology has produced anywhere in the empire, and the world they describe is the world that the Ninth Legion inhabited. The tablets are thin slivers of wood, typically about the size of a modern postcard, though varying considerably. Written on with ink in a cursive hand that the scholars who first encountered them found extremely difficult to read, but that subsequent generations of epigraphers, working with infrared imaging technology, have now deciphered with considerable completeness. They date from approximately 85 to 130 CE, which spans the period of the Ninth's active service in Britain and the years immediately following its disappearance from the record, and they were preserved because the successive wooden buildings of the fort were dismantled and their contents swept into rubbish deposits that were then covered by subsequent construction, creating the waterlogged anaerobic conditions in which organic materials survive. The range of what the tablets document is extraordinary. There are military strength reports, the document known as Tabula Vindolanda 2154, which reports the strength of the first cohort of Tungrians at Vindolanda in a given period, giving the total number of men, those sick, those on detachment, those absent on various duties, and those actually present and available for duty. And this kind of administrative document is exactly the type that would have been produced by every unit in the Roman army, including the IX Hispana. The numbers in the Tungrian Strength Report tell a specific and somewhat sobering story. Of the unit's nominal strength of 752 men, only 265 were actually present at the fort on the date in question, the rest being detached to various duties across the region. This pattern of dispersal, of a unit's strength being spread across multiple locations for multiple purposes, rather than concentrated at its home base, is characteristic of Roman military administration generally, and is relevant to thinking about how the Ninth might have been deployed in its final period. There are letters between officers, communications that range from requests for more beer to discussions of military intelligence to the invitation from Claudius Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina that represents the oldest known letter written in Latin by a woman. The beer request, one officer writing to ask for more supplies of Celtic beer for his unit, is one of the tablets that most directly challenges the image of the Roman army as a purely Mediterranean institution, because it reflects the specific adaptations that legions and auxiliaries made to the specific environment of the northern frontier. Wine, the standard drink of the Roman Mediterranean, was an expensive import in Britain. Beer, brewed from local grain, was what the soldiers of the north actually drank, and the administrative machinery that supplied the army accommodated this reality with the same pragmatic efficiency that it accommodated every other practical requirement of frontier service. There are lists of goods, shoes, socks, underpants, hunting nets, a cloak, spices, that give a specific and intimate sense of what soldiers on the British frontier needed and requested from home and from their supply networks. The mention of underpants is always noted with some pleasure by lecturers who want to make the point that Roman soldiers wore something under their kilts, a question that has generated more popular curiosity than the evidence warrants. But the broader point of these lists is that they reveal a material culture of the frontier that was considerably more varied and more domestically comfortable than the military image of the legionary suggests. Men who were requesting hunting nets and spices were not living in the austere barracks of military imagination, but in something more like the life of a permanent community with normal domestic requirements. Just south of Hadrian's Wall, and representing perhaps the most extraordinary single find in the archaeology of Roman Britain, give a vivid sense of the administrative texture of Roman military life on the British frontier. They include strength reports, supply requisitions, correspondence between officers, personal letters from soldiers to their families and vice versa, and the famous birthday party invitation from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, the oldest surviving document written in Latin by a woman, and one of the most unexpectedly intimate finds in all of Roman archaeology. The Vindelander tablets date to the late 1st and early 2nd century, exactly the period when the 9th was still active in Britain, and while they do not directly mention the 9th, they relate to the garrison of Vindelander itself, which was an auxiliary unit. They provide the atmospheric context for understanding what British frontier life was like in the 9th's time. The question of what happened to the 9th Legion is, in the end, a question about the limits of what historical inquiry can establish. But before we inhabit those limits, it is worth acknowledging one more dimension of the physical record that the 9th left in Britain: the road system and fort network of the northern frontier that represents the most lasting material contribution of any Roman legion to the landscape it occupied. The Roman roads of northern Britain, Ermine Street running north from London through Lincoln, the 9th's earlier base, to York, Deer Street running north from York through the Pennines into Scotland, the Staingut and the various lateral roads that connected the frontier forts, were built in significant part by legionary labour, and the 9th's long tenure at York placed it at the operational centre of the northern road network. Roman roads were not merely military infrastructure, though military mobility was their primary purpose. They were also the arteries of the provincial economy, the routes along which goods, messages and people moved with a speed and reliability that the pre-Roman road system of trackways and river crossings could not provide. The road from York south to Lincoln and on to London connected the northern frontier to the economic heart of the province, and the road from York north toward the Scottish border connected the legionary base to the forward positions where the 9th's detachments operated. The forts that the road network connected are Aldborough, Assurium Brigantum, the administrative capital of the Brigantian territory, at Catterick, at Piercebridge, at Binchester and Greta Bridge, were built and garrisoned and maintained during the 9th's time in the north, and the archaeological record of their construction phases shows the imprint of the legionary construction teams that the 9th provided. Road building and fort construction were not incidental activities for a Roman legion. They were a primary function, the means by which the army projected Roman authority across a territory, and made that authority permanent rather than merely demonstrated by occasional military presence. The roads and forts that the 9th built in the north of Britain outlasted the 9th itself by centuries. The physical infrastructure of Roman authority maintained by the 6th Victrix, and the other units that inherited the 9th's northern role. The road system also reveals something important about the operational pattern of the 9th service. The constant dispersal of detachments across the frontier zone, the specific demands of frontier maintenance that spread a legion's manpower across dozens of small posts rather than concentrating it at its home base. A unit as dispersed as a frontier legion would have been extremely vulnerable to a coordinated large-scale attack at a moment of imperial distraction, which is precisely what the years around 117 CE provided. If the 9th was the unit responsible for the northern sector of British frontier defence, and if the northern sector was the scene of the serious military trouble that the literary sources allude to in the early Hadrianic period, then the 9th's dispersal across the frontier zone could have made it impossible to concentrate sufficient force to respond effectively to whatever the threat was, and about what we do with those limits when we encounter them. The evidence that survives is insufficient to resolve the mystery, and the probability that new evidence sufficient to resolve it will emerge is uncertain, but not negligible. Archaeological discovery is genuinely unpredictable, and the British soil and the soils of the Eastern Mediterranean have not yet yielded everything they contain. But it is also possible that the mystery will remain unresolved indefinitely, that the specific document or inscription or physical deposit that would answer the question simply does not survive, and that the 9th Legion's fate will remain in the space between what the evidence shows and what happened. This is not a comfortable conclusion for people who want mysteries to resolve. It is, however, an honest one, and there is something important in sitting with the honesty rather than reaching for the satisfying resolution that the evidence does not provide. The genuine mystery is more interesting than the solved one, because the genuine mystery forces you to inhabit the limits of the knowable, to feel, directly and specifically, what it means that the Roman Empire has been gone for 1500 years, that most of its documents are lost, that the specific human beings whose decisions and experiences made up the daily life of the 9th Legion are in most cases entirely unknown to us. Lucius Ducius Rufinus, the standard-bearer whose funerary inscription survives at York, is one of the most specific individual humans we can name from the 9th's long history. Most of his colleagues left no trace. Their lives were real, their service was real, their deaths or retirements or disbandments were real events in the world, and they are silent. What the mystery of the 9th Legion gives us, beyond the specific historical questions it raises, is a lesson in the nature of historical knowledge itself. We know a great deal about the Roman army in general, its organisation, its equipment, its tactics, its administrative systems, its daily life, its religious practices, its social structure. We know a fair amount about the 9th Legion specifically, its origins, its campaigns, its British service, the inscriptions it left, the fortress it built. And then we hit the wall, not Hadrian's wall, but the epistemic wall that separates what the evidence shows from what actually happened. And beyond that wall is silence, and the specific shape of that silence is the mystery we have been discussing all evening. The Caledonians, who may or may not have destroyed the 9th in the Highlands of Scotland, left no written record of their victory if they won one. The Parthian or Jewish fighters, who may or may not have destroyed the 9th in the east, left no specific record of their victory if they achieved it. The Roman administrator, who may or may not have ordered the 9th disbanded, left no clear record of the order. The soldiers of the 9th themselves, whoever and wherever they were when the institutional thread of the Legion's existence finally broke, left no account of what they experienced. The silence is total, and the mystery that the silence contains is one of the most genuinely haunting in the history of the ancient world. One final thread deserves to be followed before the fire goes out entirely. The question of what happened to the men, as distinct from the institution. Even if we knew with certainty that the 9th Legion as an institution was destroyed in a specific battle, or disbanded by administrative order on a specific date, the 5,000 or 6,000 individual human beings who were its members at any given moment in its history were not all in the same place at once. Legions dispersed their manpower across vast territories. Detachments served at distant postings. Men were on sick leave, on special assignment, on temporary duty with other units. When the 9th disappeared as an institution, whether in battle, by decree, or by some other means, the men who were not present at whatever decisive moment ended it would have been incorporated into other units, would have completed their service and been discharged, would have lived out their lives in the province where they had served. The veterans of the Ninth who survived whatever happened to it, who were discharged at the end of their service or transferred to other units and served out their careers there, would have retired, as Roman veterans typically did, to the vicinity of the base where they had served. The town of York that grew up outside the legionary fortress, the colonia, the civilian settlement where veterans and their families and the merchants and craftsmen who served the military community lived, would have absorbed them. Their descendants would have been Romanized Yorkshiremen, speaking Latin and British, and eventually the Germanic languages that the post-Roman period introduced, leaving no trace of the specific institutional identity that had defined their fathers' or grandfathers' working lives. The Ninth Legion dissolved ultimately not only into the silence of the historical record, but into the population of a city that would carry its physical legacy in its underground for 2,000 years. The night has settled in fully now, and the fire that the Ninth Legion soldiers kept burning in the long northern winters of Roman Britain has been out for a very long time. The fortress at York is underground, the walls of the barrack blocks dissolved into the soil of a modern city that has no awareness of what it is built on top of, though occasionally when a building foundation is dug in the right part of York, a Roman stone appears, and for a moment the Ninth is visible again, briefly and partially before the concrete goes in and covers it over. Hadrian's wall is still there, or most of it, running across the most dramatic landscape in northern England. The windsill, the volcanic escarpment that gives the central section of the wall its spectacular cliff-top position, with the view north towards Scotland stretching for miles in clear weather. Walking the wall in the autumn, when the light is low and the grass has gone golden and the wind is up from the north, is one of those experiences of the physical past that the written record cannot quite replicate. The sense that the men who built this were addressing a specific problem that the landscape itself poses, that the wall runs along this ridge because this ridge is where you can see the furthest and be seen the least from the country beyond. The problem the wall was built to address still feels present in the landscape, even though the people who built it and the people they built it against are equally gone. Somewhere north of the wall, or somewhere in the dust of the eastern Mediterranean, or somewhere in the administrative records that did not survive, the Ninth Legion's story ended. The specific men, their names and their faces and their particular deaths or retirements or transfers to other units, are lost. The eagle that they carried, the gold standard that was the most sacred object in their possession, that they carried from Hispania to the Danube to Britain, and wherever they went after Britain, is lost too or has not been found, which at the distance of 2,000 years amounts to the same thing. What remains is the question, and the question is one of the good ones, the kind that stays open because the evidence genuinely does not close it, the kind that the human imagination is drawn to not because it promises an answer, but because the asking of it brings you into contact with something real. The fact that the past was full of specific human beings, living specific lives that mattered entirely to them and barely at all to the record that was kept of them. The soldiers of the Ninth Legion marched through the world and left their tile stamps in the mud and their altars to Silvanus on the roadside, and their funerary inscriptions in the stone of a city that would eventually bury them, and then they were gone, and the mystery of where and how they were gone is the shape that their presence left in the silence. Let that settle around you now. The wall is dark and the north beyond it is dark, and the question is still open, the way good questions always are. The eagle is somewhere. The men are somewhere. The story is somewhere in the evidence that did not survive, and the silence where it should be is the most interesting silence in Roman history. Rest easy.